stand right about here. So as we get started, yeah, so I am thrilled to be here. I really wanted to start by thanking Drew and Colleen and Lauren, who've already been terrific hosts. And I've already just came out of like a really stimulating conversation about the use of research evidence. So I'm really looking forward to this presentation and engaging with all of you. So the work that I'm going to be talking about is work that we initiated at the William T. Grant Foundation a little over a decade ago, trying to understand the use of research evidence. And I hope to unpack that for you over the course of the next hour. So I've got three pretty simple things I want to accomplish with my presentation. I want to explain to you why we care about the use of research evidence. I want to tell you a little bit about what we're learning about the use of research evidence. And I want to think with you a bit about what the implications are of what we're learning. For those of you who listen to NPR, you might have heard our tagline, the William T. Grant Foundation, our mission is to support research to improve the lives of young people. And the way we think we do that is we support research to inform policy and practice to improve the lives of young people. So this is our long-standing mission. It's what we hope to achieve. It's why we support research. But about 10 years ago, we had to take a good, hard, honest look at ourselves and say, this is our mission, this is what we have NPR talk about, but actually, are we really doing this? Are we supporting research that is actually informing policy practice to improve the lives of young people? And what we could do is kind of look backwards with 20/20 hindsight and say, yes, this study seems to be really influential. That one got cited here, that one got picked up there. But really, we did not have a very good systematic understanding of when, how, or under what conditions research evidence got used. And we had some conjectures, but we didn't really have any rigorous knowledge of what it takes for research evidence to be used. We didn't really have prospective understanding of how to make it happen more often, more routinely, or better. And so it was really thinking, how can we do a better job of fulfilling our own mission? And within the broader research community, I think this really resonates too, right? Because so many researchers and research funders are in this business because they want their research to be useful and they want it to be used to improve outcomes. And so it is part, I think, of a larger enterprise of trying to figure out what does it take? What does it take for research to be used? And so out of that, we decided to fund an initiative on the use of research evidence. This is my visualization of the gap between research and practice. And when we first came to this field about a decade ago, the good news is that there were a lot of attempts to build bridges between research and practice. The challenge, though, I think, is that a lot of those attempts were sort of one-way streets. So it's like you build a bridge, and then you just got to get research to practice. So it was kind of conceived of and conceptualized as this gap, we need to build bridges, and then we just need to do a better job pushing research out to practice. And because we framed the problem in that way, as this one-way street, I think for quite a long time, the thrust of a lot of the work coming out of the research community and research funding community fell into certain kinds of buckets. First, there was a strong focus on rigor, and I think that's best demonstrated through the Institute of Education Science. So when it was first established, it created a goal that really emphasized the production of more rigorous causal evidence about the impact of programs and practices. There were fellowship programs and training grants that were wrapped around improving the rigor of what works evidence. And that created a lot of attention. And beyond education, you could also see some very similar trends. So outside, IES had the What Works Clearinghouse, but there were clearinghouses popping up over the last decade in many other agencies. SAMHSA has a clearinghouse. The child welfare, there's a child welfare clearinghouse in California. There's crimesolutions.gov in the Justice Department. There was a big push towards increasing the rigor, specifically around what works evidence. And a lot of the thinking has been, well, if evidence isn't being used, we got to make it more rigorous and fit to be used. So there was a lot of this implicit thinking going on. The second big push was for dissemination. So this idea, if we produce more rigorous research evidence, it's still not getting used. We've got to do a better job of pushing it out. And I think about this whole class of dissemination study. This idea of, and the IES goal structure really reflected this sort of this model, this stage model of doing research. Start with small scale efficacy trials, you move to larger effectiveness trials, and then you move up to scale up and implementation trials. And if you think about other funding agencies, in the National Institute of Health, to some degree in the CDC, you also see the similar stage model of dissemination research. And again, this is a similar idea to push research out to the world. And even outside of this world of evidence-based programs and practices, I would argue that you also have this broader sense of dissemination, in the sense that we just got to get better at communicating research. We just need to do a better job of pushing it out there. We need to learn how to write better briefs. We need to learn how to talk in English and get the jargon out of our research. So in a whole lot of ways, there's this larger classification strategy that will really push out strategies. And then third, especially in federal government, but also in large foundations, you saw the focus on incentives, right? So the idea of you make evidence more rigorous, especially around what works evidence. You do more to disseminate it and push it out. Well, and then you got to add on the incentives so that practitioners, agencies, will adopt the evidence-based programs and practice. And I'll show you later just some of the examples of the many incentives that were put in place both under the George W. Bush and the Obama administration. So this is sort of, I think, the field as it was at about 10 years ago. When we came into this field, we thought, this one-way street, this research to practice conceptualization doesn't seem quite right to us. And we wanted to really think about how might we think about this more as a two-way street. It's not just about a research push to practice problem, but what do we need to understand about practice that could inform research, or policy that can inform research? How do we create more of a two-way street, reciprocal relationship? And so we said, let's focus in. Let's put the would-be users of research at the center of our inquiry. Because a lot of the other stuff I just showed you was really centered on researchers' perspective, our sort of worldview and how we think about the problem. We said, so let's actually try to put the would-be users at the center. And the users can be, different groups, right? If you think about who we hope will take up and use our research, it can be policymakers, it can be legislative branch, it can be executive branch, it can be the judicial branch. It can be, in education, school district superintendents, it can be their senior cabinet, chief academic officer, it can be the executive director of English language learners, it can be principals. So you could think about this wide array of research users. And part of the challenge in this field is actually trying to strategically narrow in who are the would-be users of research. Who are the people that we hope will take up and use our research? Rather than, I think sometimes we too blanketly state policymakers and practitioners without realizing the real richness of different people in different roles who have different authority to do different things. So we said when we launched this initiative, let's focus on the users of research evidence. The current status, just very quickly, studies of the use of research evidence are not brand new. In many ways, they had their heyday, I would say, in the 1970s and 80s. I hope what we have is a second heyday of it. But in the 1970s and 80s, there's a lot of great work being done by Carol Weiss. Some of you maybe Cohen, a lot of folks, academics, were writing about and thinking about the use of research evidence. But for whatever reason, it died out. There was like sort of this rich study of the stuff, and it died out. And what we have tried to do at the William T. Grant Foundation, starting about 10 years ago, is to bring it back as a field, actually study. So today, these are the most recent numbers. We funded about $20 million in grants over the last decade, about 55 studies. About half of them have been in education. We didn't go out to create that, but that's what we've ended up with. And then half are in more human services areas, including child welfare, health, and mental health, and a couple of sprinkling of other areas as well in justice. That's where the nexus of a lot of the work is. I'm going to talk to you today a little bit about phase 1 of our initiative. I'm going to end the talk with some things about phase 2 of our initiative, which we just launched, about a year ago. The good news also is that in this new phase, I think this hopefully this new renaissance of work on the use of research evidence, it isn't just us at the William T. Grant Foundation. Institute of Education Sciences put for 2 national research centers on knowledge utilization. So harking back to the term that Carol Weiss used, knowledge utilization, $10 million, 2 national research centers. The National Institute of Justice was also funding some studies of the use of research evidence through RFAs. Their Education Endowment Foundation in the UK is also funding some of this work. And then there's even a journal, an international journal focused on evidence and policy. So I put all this to you to say, I think this is a really exciting time for this field of studying the use of research evidence, and it's growing. So let me back up a little bit, try to have you unpack what is this stuff around studying the use of research evidence. And I always like to start with this very basic core concept. What does it even mean to use research? And this is useful because I think many of us have implicit assumptions or ideas about what it means for someone to use research, maybe even to use the research that you produce. That it's amazing how many of us have sort of an instrumental use in mind, right? And it's this idea that there's a decision maker out there, has a decision to make, and they have a choice to make about something they're going to do, and they don't have enough information about, what they need to do. So they go out in search of information. Maybe if they're lucky, they find some research that provides the missing piece of information, and they apply it to their decision. And that's the use of research, right? So it's a rational linear model of research evidence use. And that basic model, sometimes it gets dressed up in different bells and whistles, but it's nevertheless this idea of research provides important information that decision makers need. We just need to get it to them so they can apply. But when you study the use of research evidence, or if you have ever been working in a policy setting, you know that it never happens. First of all, you rarely have a lone decision maker sitting in his or her office alone, going out searching for the missing piece of information that will help them solve that. Instead, even when research comes to a decision-making table, there are always other forms of evidence and other considerations that come to the table. People are looking at their prior experience. What is my prior experience with reform efforts? What is my prior experience trying to implement a new professional development program? They're bringing that to the decision-making table. They're using their professional judgment about what they will think they will work based on what they know about their employees and their staff, their kids. Certainly, they're using local data, right? So school districts are, they're looking at their own data analysis. Child welfare agencies are doing the same thing. That's at the table. Politics are at the table, right? Any political leader or any district administrator, any agency manager is thinking about what are the political ramifications for this decision? If I go this way, what are the challenges going to be? What are the politics that's going to be? They'll have to navigate this stuff. They're also undoubtedly going to think about values. people bring their values, their work into the decision-making table. And they're also thinking about the values of their communities and their constituents. And of course, they're thinking about their staff and their clients. So, in education, they'd be thinking about the teachers, the principals. They'd be thinking about the students. And so all of this, so this is just to say that when we think about the use of research evidence in decision-making, it's always coming to the table in the midst of a lot of other forms of evidence and other types of considerations. And so when we think about what's the role of research evidence, and what's the influence of research evidence, it's within this messier decision-making table. And then when you study decision-making, it's not really an isolated decision that you're interested in. It's not the decision that the superintendent made on Thursday at 3 o'clock, right? Because that's not the way decision-making, any kind of meaningful decision-making occurs. Usually, it's a chain of decision-making. And often, it's not linear, right? It can start, it can stall, and then it can start again. If you think about the decision to design, implement, roll out, let's say, new math pathways or new program, it's not a decision that's made at a single meeting or a single moment in time. It's this course decision. So then when we think about the use of research, we're trying to understand how research comes into play over the course of decision making. So that's the instrumental use of research. We could also think about the conceptual use of research. So if instrumental use is about use in a decision or decision context, conceptual use is much more about how research influences ideas. Okay, a problem, how is a problem defined? And that's important because how a problem is defined shapes the kinds of solutions you're going to orient yourself to. This is what Carol Weiss called the enlightenment function of research. It's how research enlightens the way people think about problems or potentials. And again, even when it comes to the conceptual use of research, it occurs in the context of a lot of other stuff. Contemporary scholars who study the conceptual use of research naturally bring their own disciplinary backgrounds to it. So a lot of the education researchers have thought about the conceptual use of research in terms of this concept of learning. And I think that's really intriguing because if you think about the use of research as learning, and you think about what learning means, right? Student learning is not like a teacher depositing knowledge in the head of a student, right? No one would say, wow, that's great learning, right? Well, that means that the use of research by policymakers, not a researcher depositing knowledge in the head of a policymaker, and then they go off and do something different, right? Research is more of a continuous process, right, where you revise your internal representation in what you know in light of additional information. It's socially mediated, it's cognitively mediated, but it's also socially mediated. And if you think about learning, not just for adults or individuals, decision makers, you could also think about learning in terms of organizations. How do organizations learn? And that's an interesting conceptual, I think, way of thinking about the use of research evidence is how do people incorporate new knowledge and how is it mediated through cognitive, social, organizational process. Political scientists might think about conceptual use, I think, more in terms of how political problems or how policy problems get framed, right? So if you think about the way policymakers talk about, policy problems, they're always framing it in a certain way, right? And so you could think about the conceptual use of research evidence framing the ways in which they define a problem, or what is even considered a policy problem. Lastly, of course, we have strategic uses of research evidence, or some people might call it symbolic uses of research evidence. And that's when someone already knows what they want to do. They already know, I support this program, I don't support this reform effort. And then what they do is they leverage, muster up all the research and other types of evidence and arguments they can muster in support of that position. And that also happens very frequently. I should note that I kind of set these up as if these are three very different types of research and they can be clearly delineated. I think in actuality, they're much more blurred, and the boundaries are not nearly as rigid as I might have presented. You know, often people, you know, research may influence the way they conceptualize a problem and then set them on a course of decision making, right? So these things are more blended. But nevertheless, I think it's a useful topology for us to consider. I'm now going to walk you through a couple of actual studies of the use of research evidence, just to give you a flavor of what kinds of things we're learning. And one of the wonderful studies that have been conducted by Lorraine McDonald and Stephen Weatherford, they're political scientists at UC Santa Barbara, and they took this case of the Common Core state standards. And it's an interesting case study because as a youth education, you probably know that for quite a while, the standards were promoted as being research evidence. And the people who were promoting it really emphasized. And as we'll see, they actually built in some mechanisms for getting research evidence. And for a while, at least, the Common Core state standards was pretty successful in the sense that 46 states did adopt the English language arts and math standards. I think we all know the political fallout from that, but if you think about just trying to learn from what happened during at least that arc of it, it's useful for these purposes. And as political scientists, they think about the policy process. So they think about the use of research evidence from problem definition to policy development to policy adoption. Actually, let me back up. The way to think about it here, the policy here would be the adoption of the actual standards themselves. So just to be clear on that. And what they talk about is they think about the stages, the different stages of the policy process. So defining the problem, developing the standards, adopting the standards. So here again, the standards are the policy in this situation. Thinking about who are the research users, who are the people, who are the actors who actually use the research and promote it, and then what was the actual research evidence. And what they find is that when it came to defining the problem, the big actors that really promoted it were largely former governors, education advocates, to some extent the National Governors Association, the Council of Chief State School Officers. And what they did is, here's an example of one of the things that NGA, the National Governors Association, Council of Chief State School Officers, and achieved did in promoting the standards. This is the most recent promotion of the standards. The idea of national standards goes back to the first Bush administration. So this is just the most recent push. But if you look at how they define the problem in the research, they say they recommend adopting a common core of internationally benchmarked standards in math and language arts for grades 10 to 12 to ensure that students are equipped with the necessary knowledge and skills to be globally competitive. And when you look through a lot of the research that was actually cited, they were doing is they were looking at international comparisons of U.S. students compared to global competitors and making the argument that the U.S. students were not very competitive compared to the U.S. global competitors, and that this had to do with the fact that the U.S. did not have national standards, which a lot of these other global competitors. So they were piecing together evidence from these international studies to make the case that for Common Core state standards. Should I follow that? Yeah. Okay. I see some like quizzical looks, so I wasn't sure. Okay. So when it came to developing the standards, so that's the first part of the policy process, trying to define the problems. But then when it came to actually developing the standards, NGA and CCSSO really stepped into the fore. You know, there were many more of the advocates for the front end. But then the NGA and CCSSO really stepped into the fray. And then they created a whole group of standard writers, reviewers, and validation committees to actually develop this. And here, a whole different set of research came into play. So in developing the standards, let's just I'm just going to take the math standards. So, you know, when you develop a common core state standard, it has to be standards of K-12, right? And so what they did is they looked at research on learning progressions. Now, the challenge with the research on learning progressions in math, and this is research on what do kids need to know before they learn the next thing. What's the progression of learning that needs to happen? That research was really good in the early years, like I think K to second grade, but it was really lacking, you know, for the upper grades. And so, you know, they couldn't sell a K to 2 standards. I mean, they said these are going to be K to 12 standards. So then what do you do when the research is incomplete? What they did is they brought in researchers' professional judgment. So they asked researchers to fill in where the empirical evidence was missing in terms of what they thought made sense in terms of the higher grade. They brought in not only math education researchers, but mathematicians themselves, thinking about what is this little order of concepts that makes sense. And that's how they expanded into a set of K to 12 standards. They also brought in teachers' professional judgment to develop these standards. So the 2 teachers' unions commented on the standards and gave feedback. So, for example, at the AFT, they convened what they call master teachers, or very experienced teachers, to read through the draft of the standard and offer feedback on where they thought the younger teachers, the junior teachers they mentored, would have questions. And so that fed into the standards. The standard writers also looked at the professional judgment of SCA staff. So SCAs that had a reputation of having very high standards, they also, their input fed into the development of the math standards. So what you have then is this codification of research evidence into policy theme, these standards, that actually is still an amalgamation of different forms of evidence. And so, lastly, their study, at least some of their recent work has talked about adopting the standards. We can start to think about implementation later. But it's interesting because as you shift to later stages of the policy process, it also shifts into the hands of the different policy makers. Because once the standards were developed, they needed to be adopted by state boards of education. So the state boards of education became NGA and CCSSO were still at the table in trying to push them. But then advocacy groups in states started to become very important. So part of what you're seeing here is that at different stages of the policy process, there are different actors. And because there are different actors at play, there are different actors who are going to promote the use of research evidence. And different kinds of research and evidence come into play at those different stages. And in fact, when it came to the adoption, very little formal evidence was used or promoted. It was largely state-by-state comparisons. They're trying to get the states to see, state by state, here's how you stack up. And that was the more convincing evidence, not any formal research. And a lot of it became an advocacy play. So it was a lot about messaging toolkits to shape the votes. So that was about the Common Core State Standard. Let me shift a little bit to thinking about district implementation of the Common Core State Standards. We have funded Cynthia Coburn and a number of her colleagues over the years to do a couple of different projects to try to understand at the district level, as the districts are trying to implement new Common Core State Standards in math, how have they done it? What's the role of research evidence in that implementation, if at all? Now, Cynthia, for those of you who know her, is more of an organizational sociologist. She's very much in education, so she thinks a lot about learning. So she brings that lens into these studies. So when she's thought about the use of research, she's been really focused on what does it mean for organizational learning, thinking about organizational capacity here of districts or subunits within districts, and the role of external partners, specifically research partners. And this is where her studies of research practice partnerships come into play. So here's just the quick and dirty conceptual framework that she's been interested in, which is to understand how are research ideas from an external partner? Say a research partner, research practice partner, influence the use of research in terms of organizational learning. What is also the role of the department's capacity? And she plays with this framework of absorptive capacity to influence the ways in which the practitioners and researchers interact and what happens in terms of use of research. So I'll present to you some findings she has of two different departments, both in the same district. So she's holding the district constant, but looking at different districts. And both of these departments are working on professional development in math, okay? And one of the departments tends to have more capacity than the other departments. Their leadership is different. Their amount of knowledge of math education really differs across these two units. Their ability to draw their networks within the district is also. And one of these departments is really well connected to other departments. And when it needs knowledge and know-how, they have these close relationships and can draw knowledge from their colleagues across the district. The other one is a little more socially isolated. And then, like I said, the leaders in these two departments are different. And that shows up, I'll show you guys. That shows up in how they then structure the interactions between the researcher and the district. So in the lower capacity department, they had few informal connections with the partner. So the partner would only be brought in to say, you're helping us with this piece of work that's on our math professional development, and that's it. And they would kind of go in and out. They were structured then more as a service provider that came in and out.
As a what?
A service provider, more of a service provider. In Department B, where there was sort of I would characterize as a stronger leader, more absorptive capacity, the leader insisted that the research partner come in and sit in on their department meetings, come in and advise them as they're doing their strategic planning and their work. So they made the research partner come in and be a more intimate sort of partner and colleague in the work. And then they had a lot of informal connections. So not just in these meetings, but more of these like researcher on speed dial kind of interactions. And then what she found is that seemed to lead when she looked at, and this is a longitudinal study, so she looked at this over time, is that over time, the Department B, with more absorptive capacity, seems that are able to incorporate the research ideas into their work, and both into their policies and into the routines that they established over time. And it was just much less frequent in Department A. So partly, I think why this is interesting is just starting to think about what does it take, right, when we get into agencies and thinking about, the units that we're working in. What is the capacity that it takes? What are the interactions that are necessary to foster the use of research evidence? Okay, now let me shift gears again and talk about evidence-based programs. Because as I said at the beginning of the talk, evidence-based programs has been one of the huge pathways by which researchers have sought to get evidence into practice. And I would say of the last 15 years, we were in sort of a what works moment. So there was a huge what works agenda in the United States. I do a lot of work with colleagues in the UK, and I have to say, I'm always struck by the differences between what the what works agenda looks like in the UK and in the US. But I think it's demonstrated, the sort of ascendance of the what works agenda is demonstrating a lot of things. One is this proliferation of clearinghouses that I mentioned earlier. Another is in the huge rise in funding for evaluations in education and many other areas. And then the third is in terms of the incentives and requirements that started to be attached to the adoption of evidence-based programs and practices. And as I mentioned before, I won't go into this in detail, but evidence-based programs really follows the stage model of research. And interestingly enough, if you go on the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration's website, and you look at the stage model for their research, it's very similar to this. So it really comes out of a medical model of research. Coming out of the recession, there was an opportunity as the federal government set aside money for states and communities to incentivize the adoption of evidence-based programs, which attach these incentives and requirements into different pieces of legislation in different areas. So one example in education is I3, the Investing in Innovation Fund, which was part of the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act of 2009. In the first round, I think it was funded for at least 3 rounds. The first round was $1.1 billion. But what I want to show you is that it occurred in a lot of different areas. Teen pregnancy prevention, home visiting programs, social innovation fund, trade adjustment assistance to community college and career training, workforce innovation fund. I think there were a few others, one in international development that came along later. But the basic idea of all of these initiatives was that you attach more money to programs with greater evidence of effectiveness. So in I3, you had development grants that were, I can't now remember the amount of money they're available for, and then you had innovation grants, validation grants, eligible for more money, and then the scale-up grants, which were eligible for $50 million each. And so more money attached to more evidence. Now, the challenge is you had a lot of that going on at the federal level, right? And I would say you also had quite a bit of it going on in terms of large private foundations too, who were also using this similar stage model for funding research. I think the challenge was that, what did it mean for local decision makers? And here again, I think just understanding the use of research evidence at the local level is very useful. And here you might think about the use of research evidence in terms of decisions about whether or not to adopt and how to implement these evidence-based programs. You know, and what you've learned about at the local level when you study this stuff is that agency leaders and managers certainly are interested in evidence of impact as the program works, definitely interested in that question. They may not define rigorous evidence in the same way of that impact in the same way. And in fact, in studies when people have asked agency leaders and managers how they define evidence-based programs, you get a whole string of different answers that really don't map onto how most researchers define evidence of impact. But nevertheless, you know, they do talk about, they're interested in does it work. They're also, of course, as I said before, looking at their local data. Does the group for which this program is designed for fit the youth that we have, that we're supposed to be serving in our agency, for example? They're thinking about their clients. Does it fit what we know about the youth that we're serving? What is our implementation capacity? Do we have the capacity to implement this intervention? And here I think it's important because when we ask agency leaders and managers about implementation, their implementation questions are often very, very different than the implementation questions that researchers. You know, I think the point of the realm in implementation research has been fidelity and dosage and fidelity, right? And maybe now there's this thing about fidelity versus adaptation. But when you talk to agency leaders and managers, when they're struggling with implementation issues, they come up with a much larger array of questions. They're trying to figure out, do we have the staffing for this? How much training would be required? How am I going to finance it? How do I ensure consistency across the different agencies or organizations? And so it's also striking that if we think about research on implementation, are we even studying the implementation questions that are key on the minds of agency leaders and managers? So they're thinking about implementation capacity, and they're certainly thinking about community context. They're really plagued by thinking about, is it an urban context in which this work was done? Is it not mine? Rural stuff is huge. And you find it certainly for schools, and you find it for child welfare agencies, probation officers, mental health agencies. So I put this up there because if you contrast it with the theory of action, a lot of the federal incentives and requirements attached to the adoption of evidence-based programs and practices, it didn't do a whole lot to help local level decision makers navigate this much more complex decision space that they're interested in. And so as those of us interested in the use of research evidence, or interested in the use, adoption, implementation of evidence-based programs, we have to start thinking about what does it mean for the research users. Oh, and so lastly, I got this idea from Lori McDonald and Stephen Weatherford that when we think about the use of research evidence, I think we can start to think about it as evidence integration. How do people integrate these different forms of evidence together? So earlier, I talked about the research to practice gap, right? This one-way street approach, which led us, I think, for 10, 15 years on these certain sort of paths and certain kinds of solutions focused on rigor, dissemination, and incentives. I'd like to think that the next decade, the next 15 years of work are going to be much more of a two-way street approach to thinking about this problem. And it's not going to be a research to practice problem, but it'll be a research and practice. It's not going to be a research to policy problem, it'll be a research and policy problem. And what that allows us to do, I think, I hope, is to have much more of this iterative back and forth. It's also about what do we need to know about policy or practice that will drive the work we do as researchers. And I think if we do that, we're going to come up with a whole host of other kinds of solutions that we'll try out and strategies that we'll try out. I think it'll help us focus more on research that's useful and actually likely to be used, because if we better understand policymakers' dilemmas, the kinds of implementation questions that they have, that could shape the kinds of implementation research that we are doing. It's also, I hope, going to help us better understand not just how to create more useful research, but also help to see that it's used. So because you can still have a lot of relevant research, it doesn't mean that it's not used. So help us make some of those bridges. I hope that we're shifting from dissemination strategies to thinking more seriously about engagement strategies. Engagement strategies suggest more of an interactive back and forth. It's not just pushing out research. It's figuring out how to have a dynamic interaction. And that's important because research never speaks for itself. It always has to be interpreted. So researchers, I hope, are at the table, the figurative table, in interpreting what research means. And it's important for researchers to be at the table interpreting what research means. Because research often doesn't help someone understand. Research here will not necessarily help someone understand in another place, another context, what are the implications for the current problem I have in front of me, given the current history. It's an interpretive activity that's required. And researchers can be there to help say, well, we do have research on this, we don't know on that. They can also, if they know the designs and the methods that were used to generate the research evidence, the strength of the research evidence, its limitations, it can help people draw more or less plausible conclusions from that. And that requires engagement, that requires a back and forth. Producing more useful research evidence also requires that, because it's not like policymakers just deliver you their research questions, or practitioners just deliver their research questions. It takes a give and take, a back and forth to really understand what are the policy dilemmas. And this is one of the reasons we've been very interested in research practice partnerships, because they are a mechanism for creating ongoing interaction between researchers and practitioners, so they're better able to co-define a research agenda that's meaningful for the district. And then the third set of strategies, I think, is I hope we're going to be much more focused on capacity and how to build the capacity to foster stronger and better use of research evidence. And I think of capacity on every side. You know, agencies need capacity, right, to do this work well. This is still in the arc of history, this is still a relatively new set of demands on agencies to use data, to use research evidence routinely. It's not what their organized bureaucracies are set up to do. And it takes an enormous amount of capacity to do that. If you think about the flip side, it's going to take the research community a lot of capacity too to do this work well, to learn how to construct research agendas that really matter to practice and policy. You know, if your graduate training is anything like my graduate training, I learned how to do research that fit into the scientific canon. I learned how to do research, craft a research agenda that helped push theory and the empirical body of knowledge to the next level. I didn't quite get good training on how to craft a research agenda that was theoretically meaningful, empirically rigorous, that fit what decision makers needed. And so that's going to take a lot of training and support. And if you think about the incentive systems within the academy, we're really lacking there as well in terms of the ability to create a structure that really promotes and harnesses science work. But I hope that's part of the string that we're on, the shifts that we're moving to in the next 10 to 15 years. So in terms of the WT Grant Foundation, we've shifted to phase 2 of our initiative on supporting studies in this area, science of science use. As I mentioned, phase 1 was a lot about understanding the problems, and in many ways, the findings I presented to you are largely still about describing it. We're trying to shift more into funding studies of how to improve the situation, how do you improve the use of research evidence, and testing out different kinds of ideas. Research practice partnerships are certainly fun, understanding the role of social networks, how to leverage peer networks among policymakers, practitioners, or another sort of strategy, how to create tools, decision support tools that foster, that kind of incorporate research evidence into decision making. Those are another set of strategies. So we're interested in just trying to empirically study ways of improving the use of research evidence. We think about it in 3 buckets, but I've just talked about strategies to improve the use of research evidence. But we can also back it up in terms of strategies to improve the production of useful research that is more likely to be used. That's turning an eye back on us as research community. This last one is the toughie. It's trying to understand when and how using research actually improves youth outcomes. At the end of the day, this is what we care about, is youth outcomes. We do hope, and as a research funder, we hope that research can improve youth outcomes. But there's still a very long line from research, policy, and practice, think about all the implementation down to youth outcomes. And so what we're interested in, and they can be also, I think too often researchers ourselves, we assume that if only people use research outcomes, and that's not necessarily the case. We don't actually have a lot of evidence about it. So, but we are interested in trying to better understand this problem space. What does it take? Or when or how? What are the conditions under which using research will actually lead to improvements in youth outcomes? And I think that's the next frontier of work. Okay, let me end with my bets. I like to put it this way because I don't think any of us have it figured out. When people talk as if they do, my eyebrows always raise. But I do, I having supported this work for about a decade, I do have some bets that I will place. And I think a lot of it is thinking about this idea of evidence integration. So this idea that we just have to insert research into a setting, I don't think that's going to get us where we want to be. I think we're going to have to get smarter on how to help people integrate research into the other forms of evidence and the other pieces of knowledge and information. We can help facilitate that, whether through processes of learning or the framing of policy problems. There are different ways to do this, but I think that's going to be a key element here. Ultimately, studying the use of research in policy is studying policy process. Because if we're just taking it from our vantage point as researchers and trying to follow research in, I think we're not going to get very far. Ultimately, we need to study the policy process itself and how can research make its way in and be as influential as we'd like to see it be in the policy. And I think this is critical because the best studies of the use of research evidence in policy show an understanding of the policy process. There can be some real naivete sometimes from outsiders about what that policy is. I think we're going to really have to practice that on capacity, and I think the next decade is really thinking about what is the capacity that's going to take to improve the use of research evidence, wide open space. Relationships. I didn't get to talk a lot about this, but we've supported quite a bit of work on research practice partnerships, and I think the evidence on that is quite promising, that when researchers and practitioners can come together in long-term engagements, there is the opportunity to learn from each other over time, both on how to craft more relevant research agendas, as well as to support the use of that research over time. So that's in terms of sort of a physical relationship mechanism. But I think also, if I think about broader relationships between organizations, research and practice communities, I think these mechanisms that allow for more interactive back and forth learning are probably going to be the mechanisms that help foster some closer ties. And then lastly, I think we're going to really have to think about infrastructure for this stuff. How do you sustain this stuff at a large level to make it work? My sense when I talk to agency leaders and managers, whether it's school districts or state education agencies, is that their experience of research coming at them is that it's a very, very messy space. There are a lot of people selling them. So when I do mean selling them, literally selling them research. They have a lot of vendors that are constantly coming out. They also have program developers and providers. We see that a lot in child welfare and mental health, right? There's this whole industry of evidence-based program developers and providers. And then you have all these intermediate associations, professional associations that are kind of talking about research evidence. So there's a lot coming at them all the time. It's a very busy space. Often these things are competing with each other. It's a really hard, it puts the would-be researchers in quite a difficult situation, especially when you consider what their day-to-day work lives look like, and the lack of time and ability to even sort through all the big claims and the things that are being made. And so I think, this to me could be some infrastructure problem. How do we coordinate and align some of this work to make it easier for the would-be users to make better decisions based on the research evidence? So those are my bets. They're not very specific, but hopefully they give you a sense of the directions that I think that are promising to go in. Okay.
Thank you, Vivian. That was wonderful. Questions? Comments? Sure.
Thanks for the talk, Vivian. In early childhood, which is my area, preschool, we're really trying to think about strategizing as policy researchers around key implementation issues. Because we actually haven't done a lot of implementation research, and yet we have a number of, for example, pre-K programs or P3 systems building efforts that are based on supposed evidence, but there's really not that much evidence about implementation. And I'm just wondering, wondering if William Grant is funding any kind of initiatives like that. So, for example, I belong to a research network in New York, and in the city, all of us are doing different projects that supposedly complement one another, so that the New York City public school system has information that they can use to actually shape the implementation of their 3- and 4-year-old programs. And there's probably 27 of us, different research teams, working on different things with a very extreme range of methods and theoretical orientations. And it's been really helpful because all of the key leaders of city agencies come to those meetings, and then we discuss, you know, how we can work together. Now that's funded by the Foundation for Child Development.
I was going to
Jack
say,
is a good friend of mine.
yeah.
But I'm wondering if WT Grant's trying something like that, because I do a lot of work with the state here, and I just find, you know, I try and mentor my doctoral students to do this kind of work, but you know, it's not, as you say, it's not recognised in the academy because it takes so much time. So do my colleagues like Vivian and Clark. You spend ages working with the state. Like I had a project that I thought was looking like this in August, and after talking with my state agency people, I now have a completely different project for this semester. You know, and that as a researcher is hard because I have to shift gears in terms of my data collection and everything else. So I'm just wondering if you've thought about sort of strategic initiatives around that other than research itself.
Yeah, I think I do know about. I was on a panel with Jacqueline on this work, and I think it is tremendous. I mean, it is really tremendous, and I think part of what makes it tremendous is some of the things that you just described, which is that they bring the decision makers, the implementing agencies together with the researchers, so that the implementing agencies can help drive the research, and then it's fed back to the implementing agencies so they can kind of learn together over time, and they orchestrate like a lot of different project teams to do this work. Not that it's always easy.
No.
You know that, and I think that's wonderful place-based. You know, we have not done things like that. I think it's probably not going to be our niche to do that either. I think, and that's not because it's not important. It's just because we have limited resources and we got to do some focus on how we use our resources. So I think, you know, our interest in that kind of work is going to remain, you know, what can we learn about the use of the research evidence produced by that process, and what would improve the use of the research evidence through those kinds of mechanisms that might make it relevant and helpful to folks in other places, right? And I think that in attempts like this, there are always going to be cases where some things work well and some things don't. And only by studying them, and this is what we think, systematically studying them, are we going to really glean some of those insights that we hope will contribute to a broader field that's trying to figure out how to improve the use. So it's complementary, but I don't think we're going to go there. I will say that, you know, if we had a lot of resources, one thing I've always wanted to do is, which I don't know that we're going to get to, is to really do try to invigorate the field of implementation research so that the nature of the questions being asked are much more focused on the questions that implementing agents have. You know, maybe one day.
Let me know when you do. I'll be giving you a call.
Okay. Yes.
So yeah, I'm just curious about, you know, and moving from the understanding research evidence portfolio, improving research evidence portfolio. One thing that again, and I'm currently funded on a project, and we have been shifting in terms of who we are collaborating with in cross disciplines. So we're now working with decision scientists and systems engineers. We've spent a considerable amount of time trying to answer the question of how do you optimize systems performances, and fundamentally use research evidence in the context of decision scientists in the clinical encounter and in the context of system engineers in terms of organizational structures, and optimizing the performance of those structures. And I'm just curious, you know, there's been an interesting process for us of that earlier evidence around understanding evidence talks about how to use research evidence in a very different language than our colleagues do, right? So this is one example. Evidence integration is often thought of in decision scientists, by decision scientists, where they think about it as risk-benefit assessment and thresholds for where decisions are actually made. And so I'm just curious, as you're seeing this next set of applications, are you seeing new interdisciplinary collaborations kind of come to the portfolio like these types, and where those translational hangups may be as we try to work across this?
Yeah, I think we are. And we're also, in addition to this sort of decision sciences stuff, which I don't fully understand, to be honest. I look to you to help me understand it. So there's sort of this trend around developing decision tools. There's also another, I think, as we've shifted to interventions, it's kind of lit up some excitement among the dissemination and implementation researchers, because they tend to be more of the interventionists. I think we're still sorting through how these different fields can learn from each other. I'm sure, science communication is a third one, right? I'm sure there's something there, but I'm really struggling with it. I really am, and I think part of it is maybe some concept mapping will help us figure out when we're talking about the same thing, when we're talking about different things, and how they fit together. I don't have a great answer to that. Do you have a good answer to that?
We're working on it. Yeah, but I'll be interested to continue the conversation. Yeah, I mean, I think there is it has been an interesting process. We've even adapted our qualitative methods to accommodate the information inputs for the tools that they use. But it's been a very incremental process for us. It's been a bit of a struggle working on papers to publish out some of that work because it has taken so long just to get to the product.
Right. The thing I do think about, if you guys think about the development, not everyone, but many people are thinking about the development of decision tools to support people. It's more, it kind of creates protocols and a structured way of getting research evidence stable in decision making. One of the things I think about is, it's still the use of those, right? And how that plays out. I mean, there's still, tools are still tools. And to what extent are tools embedded in routines or decision-making processes that have to sort through that?
Okay, last question, because we have a busy day and we're going to move to L&D. So,
just quickly, firstly, sorry for coughing. I apologize, just got a frog in my throat, had to leave. But I'm curious about two things. One, you mentioned this sort of group of implementers and what you do. We do a lot of evaluations for tech grants and first in the world grants and the policymakers. I think that conversation is an easy one to have. But those Lipsky street level bureaucrats, right, those people on the ground, getting the evidence to them so that they can make the change in the way that it's meant to be made, right, and not make their own changes along the way is really important. But something that I think we've struggled with in our work. So I'm wondering if you've seen any of that.
Yeah, absolutely. And my starting point is, how do those people typically get their hands on information? Because someone is influencing, right? They're getting information from someone. Now, whether it's research, and usually you find out they get it from their peers, right? So agency leaders have a set of peers that they look to for information. Sometimes it's the professional associations, sometimes it's the people who used to work in their agency and are over there. Blah, blah. And this is true in child welfare, mental health, education, even state legislators. If you figure out how influence works in state legislatures, social networks. Yeah. So that's why I think social networks can be a very useful tool for us to leverage if we're interested in getting research out there, but also getting it trusted, because these are natural conduits. These are people that they already trust, rather than trying to build altogether new relationships of trust. So I think that's a really promising kind of direction. And Tom's nodding, so I guess he agrees.
All right, thank you so much. Let's give a round of applause. reminder, next week, our speaker is actually Leslie Charles from the library, so it's going to be more of a tutorial for students as well as faculty who want to learn a little bit more about library resources and how to navigate systems. So, we'll see you next week, and thank you all for coming.
Thank you, that was fun.
Oh, thank you.
I was supposed to attend your next meeting, but unfortunately one of my funders requested a call, so I can't. My colleague Michelle is going to attend. It's just really fascinating, given the work that we're doing, so I appreciate it. Hopefully Michelle can have some conversations with you about our work. I think your thoughts would certainly improve what we're doing.
Sure.
So great to meet you.
Hi, are you Drew?
Yes.
Hi, my name is Gabrielle.
Oh, nice to meet you. Good. How are you?
Actually, they videotape. So if you follow up with Colleen, yeah. So, like, I was just I'm sorry. About special. Like you said, your agency maybe like it's hard. I don't know enough about this. What I might suggest is go on our website and take a look at we have the ability to I should go on our website. Yeah, I think that's how that'll give you and then look at our website. Yeah, and there's some examples within the application. So, like I said, right now, the focus is kind of looking towards to making a gap, bridging a gap. I think that's what's going to do. Yes, of course. Yes, many. There were already a lot of nice to have you here. Thank you.
Right. I'm drafting the memo, and I think what I'll do next is, and here's the section plan. It's what you and an approach. See what you can do with it. Yeah. There's this dilemma. Yeah, so I'd say put it all out there.